Joseph was a young man whose heart beat with the promises of heaven. His life was marked by rejection, betrayal, and suffering from a young age. Sold into slavery by his own brothers, Joseph found himself in the hands of Potiphar, an Egyptian official. Though innocent, he was falsely accused and imprisoned. At every turn, his life seemed to crumble, but something beyond human understanding was at work. How could God turn such pain into a grand purpose? Joseph spent years in prison, with no visible hope of freedom. Promises of greatness seemed distant, almost forgotten. Yet Joseph remained faithful and upright, serving with excellence in every situation. The darkness of his cell seemed like the end, but Joseph's destiny was not sealed. What he did not know was that, amid all the trials, God was silently weaving the thread of redemption. The end of the story had yet to be told. How can we explain the mysterious ways of God? Why would a young man so innocent have to endure so much adversity? Joseph's life seemed like a tragedy in motion, a tale of accumulating injustices. But what lay in store for him went far beyond what anyone could imagine. Each fall, each injustice suffered, was a step toward the fulfillment of a much greater purpose. How could a wronged slave become the governor of Egypt? Joseph's story is a testimony to the mysterious and surprising providence of God. At the height of his suffering, God intervened in an unexpected way, completely changing his destiny. One who was rejected, sold, and forgotten would become the most powerful man in Egypt after Pharaoh. But how did this happen? And what can we learn from his journey? This is the mystery we will reveal, a story of pain transformed into glory. From the moment of Joseph's birth, Jacob held a special love for him. Joseph was the first son of Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife, who had long waited to conceive. Rachel, the woman for whom Jacob worked 14 years, died giving birth to Joseph's younger brother, Benjamin. As she breathed her last, for she was dying, she named her son Ben-Oni, but his father named him Benjamin. Genesis 35:18. The loss of Rachel made Joseph the most cherished son, the link between Jacob and the great love of his life. For Joseph, his father's favoritism manifested in a tangible way. The multicolored coat he received was not just any gift, but a symbol of honor and distinction. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. Genesis 37:3. That coat represented not only Jacob's love, but also the pain of loss and the desire to protect Rachel's legacy. However, this special love had painful consequences. Joseph's brothers, already burdened by the loss of their mother, felt rejected and overlooked. Each time they saw Joseph wearing the coat, they were reminded of the affection they so deeply longed for, but never received. Each heart knows its own bitterness. Proverbs 14:10. The coat became a symbol of what they could never have, their father's unconditional love. Resentment grew, as did the desire for revenge. Jacob's preference for Joseph was like a sharp knife that divided the family. Joseph, the beloved son, became the target of his brothers' accumulated anger. They no longer saw him as a brother, but as a constant reminder of all they had lost. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. James 3:16. Jacob's favoritism planted the seeds of a tragedy that would change Joseph's life forever. Still a young man, Joseph began to have dreams that would disturb his family and mark the beginning of his journey. One night, he dreamed that he and his brothers were binding sheaves of grain in the field. His sheaf stood upright while his brothers' sheaves gathered around and bowed down to it. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." Genesis 37:6-7. The meaning of the dream was clear to his brothers. Joseph was implying that he would rule over them. But the young man did not stop there. In another dream, he saw the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing down to him. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Genesis 37:9. The audacity of these visions further inflamed the jealousy and hatred already brewing in his brothers. Joseph's dreams were not mere fantasies, but prophetic visions given by God, revealing what was to come. However, his brothers saw only arrogance in his words. Even Jacob, who deeply loved him, rebuked Joseph, questioning whether he, his mother, and his brothers would indeed bow down to him. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" Genesis 37. Yet Jacob kept these things in mind, aware that God might be revealing something significant. These dreams would become the spark that ignited a series of painful and transformative events in Joseph's life. His brothers, already consumed by envy, decided they could not allow such dreams to come true. How could they fight against the destiny ordained by God? Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. Proverbs 19:21. What they did not know was that in trying to prevent Joseph's dreams, they were actually helping to fulfill them. The jealousy and hatred of Joseph's brothers finally reached a climax on a fateful day. While Joseph was walking toward them, sent by his father, brothers conspired against him. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Genesis 37:18. The initial plan was to kill him, but the eldest brother, Reuben, suggested throwing him into a dry cistern, the secret intention of rescuing him later. However, while Reuben was away, the brothers saw a caravan of Ishmaelite merchants approaching. Judah then proposed a new idea, selling Joseph into slavery. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. Genesis 37:26-27. Motivated by greed and resentment, the brothers agreed and sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver. Joseph, who had been the cherished son of Jacob, now found himself chained and taken to a foreign land. His cry for mercy fell on deaf ears. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, took him to Egypt. Genesis 37:28. The young man who dreamed of a future of leadership and power now walked as a slave toward the unknown. What despair must have filled his heart. The merchants took Joseph to Egypt, where he was sold to Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. His fate seemed sealed. The young dreamer was now a slave in a strange land. But even in the darkness, God was with him. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. Genesis 39. Joseph's journey was just beginning, and though everything seemed lost, God was silently orchestrating a greater plan. Upon arriving in Egypt, Joseph was purchased by Potiphar, a man of high rank, responsible for Pharaoh's guard. Although Joseph was a foreigner and a slave, he quickly distinguished himself by his integrity and skill. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. Genesis 39:2. Potiphar saw that there was something special about Joseph, something beyond his abilities. Recognizing God's favor upon him, Potiphar entrusted Joseph with the management of his entire household. Joseph became the administrator of all of Potiphar's possessions, responsible for every detail of the house. From managing the servants, overseeing the harvests and trade, Joseph prospered in everything he did. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Genesis 39:3. Joseph's faithfulness was not just to a man, to God himself. He knew that even in foreign lands, God was by his side, guiding every step. Potiphar's trust in Joseph grew to such an extent that he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Joseph, who had once been despised and sold into slavery, now governed the house of one of the most powerful men in Egypt. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. Genesis 39:5. Even in adversity, Joseph remained faithful, and God blessed him greatly. But as always, faithfulness to God often attracts challenges and temptations. Joseph was about to face a trial that would test his integrity and trust in God. Potiphar's wife, attracted by Joseph's appearance and character, cast a longing eye upon him. What would happen to Joseph in the face of this temptation? How would he maintain his faithfulness to God amid this new and dangerous trial? Joseph, blessed with wisdom and good looks, soon caught the unwanted attention of Potiphar's wife. She desired him and day after day tried to seduce him. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Genesis 39:7. For a young man who had suffered so much, this proposal might have seemed like an opportunity to ease his burden, but Joseph was different. His loyalty to God and to his master was unwavering. With each advance, Joseph firmly refused, making it clear that he could not betray Potiphar's trust or sin against God. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Genesis 39:9. The temptation was constant, but Joseph did not yield. His integrity was not just a matter of character, but of deep spiritual conviction. He knew that giving in to sin would mean betraying everything he believed in and everything he had fought for until now. Frustrated by his constant rejections, Potiphar's wife decided to act treacherously. She set a trap, and when Joseph once again resisted, she falsely accused him of attempting to rape her. He called her household servant. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed." Genesis 39:14. Her lies were enough to enrage Potiphar, who had Joseph thrown into prison. Joseph, who had been faithful in everything, now faced a new and grim reality. The one who refused sin and maintained his integrity was being punished for a crime he did not commit. But even in the depths of the prison, God's presence never left him. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Genesis 39:21. Joseph's faithfulness would be tested again, and God, in his sovereignty, would continue to guide every step of his faithful servant. Joseph was thrown into prison, a place where many lose hope, but even there, God was with him. The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Genesis 39:21. Wherever Joseph went, God's hand followed. The warden, impressed by Joseph's wisdom and integrity, put him in charge of all the prisoners, entrusting him with the administration of the entire facility. Even in prison, Joseph continued to serve with excellence. The darkness of the prison did not extinguish the light of Joseph's faith. During this time, he met two of Pharaoh's officials, cupbearer and the baker, who were also in prison. Each had a dream they could not understand, and Joseph, with God's help, correctly interpreted both dreams. Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. Genesis 40, verse 8. Joseph's interpretation revealed the fate of the two men. Cupbearer would be restored to his position, and the baker would be executed. Joseph's words came true exactly as he had predicted. However, the cupbearer, once restored, forgot about Joseph. Once again, Joseph faced the reality of being forgotten and left behind, despite having been faithful. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Genesis 40:23. For many, this could have been the end, but Joseph knew that God was in control and that, in his time, the Lord would bring justice and fulfill his plan. Joseph remained in prison, but God had not abandoned him. The one who had interpreted the prisoner's dreams would one day be called to interpret the dreams of a king. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heaven. Ecclesiastes 3:1. God's timing for Joseph's exaltation was near, and every moment of his trial was preparing him for the greater purpose that awaited him. God was about to transform Joseph's life in a way that no one could imagine. Joseph had literally and figuratively faced the bottom of the pit. From the cistern where his brothers threw him to the unjust prison in Egypt, his life seemed to be a series of misfortunes. Each moment of pain seemed to draw a dark destiny. They took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. Genesis 37:24. But even in the dry cistern, God was present, preparing Joseph for something far greater than he could imagine. Being sold as a slave seemed to be the end of his hopes. Joseph was torn from his homeland, from his family, and taken to an uncertain future. Would this be the fate of a man blessed by God? Joseph was taken to Egypt, Genesis 39:1. There, far from everything he knew, Joseph not only survived, but thrived. Every challenge, every injustice shaped his character and his faith. God was developing in Joseph the skills and strategies he would use to save entire nations. Prison, a place where hope often dies, became for Joseph a school of leadership and patience. Even there, his faithfulness and integrity were not compromised. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Genesis 39, verse 21. But why did God allow him to endure so many trials? Joseph was being prepared for something that no one, not even he, could foresee. At 17, he was not ready to govern, but now, after each test, he was prepared for the divine calling. God always had a purpose for Joseph, even when everything seemed lost. The adversities he faced were not punishments, but essential steps in God's plan. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. Isaiah 55:8. Just as Joseph gave his best at every stage, you might also wonder, why does God allow me to be in the situation I'm in? Perhaps, like Joseph, you are being prepared for something great that you cannot yet see. 2 years passed since the cupbearer was restored, and Joseph remained in prison, faithful in his trust in God. Then Pharaoh had disturbing dreams that no one could interpret. In his distress, he summoned all the magicians and wise men of Egypt, but none could decipher the mystery. It was then that the cupbearer, remembering Joseph, mentioned the young Hebrew who had interpreted his dreams in prison. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings." Genesis 41 verse 9. Joseph was quickly brought before Pharaoh. After preparing himself, he was taken to the palace, where he heard the king's dreams. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do." Genesis 41. Joseph, with humility and clarity, explained that the two dreams foretold 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of severe famine across the land. Joseph not only interpreted the dreams, but also presented a solution: to store up a fifth of the harvest during the years of abundance, to ensure that Egypt could survive the coming famine. Pharaoh, impressed by Joseph's wisdom and discernment, recognized that the Spirit of God was in him. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Genesis 41:38. Realizing that Joseph's interpretation was accurate, and that the plan he proposed was the only viable solution, Pharaoh made a surprising decision. He not only accepted Joseph's counsel, but also appointed him to implement the plan, elevating him to a position of power that no one could have predicted. Joseph, who had been taken from a prison cell, now found himself in the highest position in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Genesis 41 or 41. The journey of suffering and trial was beginning to make sense. God, in his sovereignty, had prepared Joseph for this moment. What once seemed like a series of tragedies was in fact God's perfect plan to save many lives. What would come next would be the fulfillment of all that Joseph had dreamed. Impressed by Joseph's wisdom and recognizing the presence of God in him, Pharaoh made an extraordinary decision. "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Genesis 41:38. Joseph, the forgotten prisoner, would now be elevated to the position of governor over all of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. The one who had been sold as a slave and unjustly imprisoned would now become the second most powerful man in the nation. Pharaoh entrusted Joseph with the responsibility of implementing the plan to save Egypt from famine. "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Genesis 41:41. Gave him a signet ring, dressed him in fine linen, and placed a gold chain around his neck. Joseph was paraded in a chariot throughout Egypt. Everyone bowed down before him. The young dreamer, once despised and humiliated, now saw God's promises being fulfilled in his life. Joseph, with humility and diligence, took on his new role. He traveled across Egypt, organizing the collection of grain during the years of abundance, preparing the nation for the impending crisis. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Genesis 41:49. God's plan, which had seemed so distant during the years of suffering, was now being fulfilled before Joseph's eyes and the entire nation. What seemed impossible had become reality. God turned tragedy into triumph, prison into a throne. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. Genesis 42:6. Joseph's journey reveals a profound truth. God does not forget those who remain faithful. What God had reserved for Joseph was far greater than he could have imagined. But what would happen when the brothers who betrayed him came to Egypt, seeking help? After his appointment as governor, Joseph immediately began implementing the plan he had proposed to Pharaoh. During the 7 years of abundance, he traveled throughout Egypt, supervising the collection of 1/5 of all grain production. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Genesis 41:49. With the wisdom God had given him, Joseph ensured that Egypt was prepared to face the impending crisis. The years of plenty passed quickly, and soon famine began to spread, not only in Egypt but across the surrounding lands. As predicted, the severity of the famine caused people from all over to come to Egypt to buy grain. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. Genesis 41:56. Through his diligence and obedience, Joseph became the savior of many nations. God's plan was being revealed more clearly each day. Joseph, now in a position of power and respect, saw how God had turned his trials into blessings. The one who had been sold into slavery, who had been forgotten in prison, was now the provider for all of Egypt and the surrounding nations. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe everywhere. Genesis 41:7. Joseph's faithfulness at every stage of his life was rewarded, and he was fulfilling the divine purpose. The famine that devastated the nations brought to Egypt people Joseph never imagined he would see again. His brothers, who had sold him into slavery, now came to Egypt seeking help. But they did not recognize him. How would Joseph, now endowed with power and authority, deal with this unexpected turn of events? The story God was writing in Joseph's life was about to reach a decisive point where past and present would collide in a surprising way. The 7 years of famine struck with devastating force, just as Joseph had predicted. Crops failed, and the land dried up. What had once been a prosperous nation now depended on the storehouses carefully prepared by Joseph. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." Genesis 41:5. Joseph's wisdom, guided by God, made Egypt the center of provision for many nations. The famine spread rapidly, reaching neighboring lands, including Canaan, where Joseph's family lived. Desperate, Joseph's brothers traveled to Egypt in search of food, unaware that they would face the very brother they had betrayed and sold into slavery. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" He continued, "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." Genesis 42:1-2. The reunion was about to happen, and God had already prepared Joseph for this moment. When Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt, they were brought before the governor, not recognizing that he was their lost brother. Joseph, however, recognized them immediately but kept his identity hidden. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Genesis 42:7. Joseph's heart was torn between the pain of the past and the purpose God had revealed to him. He knew this was a crucial moment where God's plan would begin to unfold more clearly. The famine continued to ravage the land, and the need for food brought Joseph's brothers back to Egypt, not just once, but twice. Each encounter with Joseph brought them closer to the final revelation. How would Joseph deal with the presence of those who had caused him so much suffering? But Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for there was famine in the land of Canaan also. Genesis 42:5. What was to come would be a test not only for Joseph, but for his entire family. The reunion between Joseph and his brothers was a moment full of tension and emotion. Joseph's brothers, hungry and desperate, arrived in Egypt, unaware that the powerful governor was the brother they had betrayed and sold into slavery. Joseph recognized them immediately, but kept his identity a secret. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Genesis 42:8. He felt the weight of the past, but he also saw the opportunity to test their character. Joseph spoke harshly to them and accused them of being spies, a ruse to assess whether they had changed since the day they betrayed him. "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." Genesis 42:9. Terrified, the brothers denied the accusations, and, not knowing who they were speaking to, revealed details about their family, mentioning their younger brother, Benjamin. Upon hearing this, Joseph remembered his family and devised a plan to bring Benjamin to Egypt. To test his brother's honesty, Joseph demanded that they bring Benjamin to prove their words. "Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison, so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth." Genesis 42:16. Joseph kept Simeon as a guarantee, and the other brothers returned to Canaan with the devastating news. When Jacob heard of Joseph's request, his heart filled with fear, for he had already lost Joseph and did not want to risk Benjamin's life. However, the famine forced Jacob to send his sons back to Egypt, this time with Benjamin. When Joseph saw his younger brother, he was deeply moved, but still did not reveal his identity. Instead, he prepared another test for his brothers. He had his silver cup placed in Benjamin's sack, accusing him of theft. How would his brothers react? "What is this you have done?" Joseph asked. "Don't you know that a man like me can find things out by divination?" Genesis 44:15. This would be the final test to see if they had truly changed. The moment of revelation was as emotional as it was unexpected. After Joseph's brothers were accused of theft and placed in a desperate situation, Judah approached Joseph and pleaded for Benjamin's life, offering himself as a slave instead. "Now then, please let your servant remain here as my lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers." Genesis 44:33. Judah's words, filled with repentance and sacrifice, deeply touched Joseph's heart. Joseph could no longer contain his tears. In an emotional gesture, he ordered everyone to leave the room except for his brothers. When he was alone with them, he revealed his true identity. "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" Genesis 45:3. His brothers were paralyzed with fear and astonishment, unable to believe what they were hearing. The brother they thought was dead or lost forever stood before them as the governor of Egypt. With great emotion, Joseph tried to calm his brothers' fears. He assured them that everything that had happened was part of God's sovereign plan. "Now, do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Genesis 45:5. Joseph now saw clearly that God had used every moment of suffering to prepare him for this purpose, not only to save Egypt, but also to preserve his own family. The reconciliation was complete when Joseph embraced his brothers, fully forgiving them. He asked them to return to Canaan and bring their father, Jacob, and the entire family to Egypt, where they could live safely during the years of famine. Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin embraced him, weeping. Genesis 45:14. Family, once torn apart by envy and betrayal, was now being reunited by God's grace and forgiveness. The news that Joseph was alive and ruling Egypt filled Jacob's heart with disbelief and joy. His sons returned to Canaan with chariots and gifts sent by Joseph, pleading with Jacob to go to Egypt without delay. "I'm convinced. My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Genesis 45:28. The heart of the patriarch, who for so many years mourned the loss of his son, was now filled with hope and joy upon learning that he was still alive. Jacob's journey to Egypt was marked by divine blessing. Along the way, God spoke to Jacob, reassuring him about moving to Egypt and promising that there he would make his descendants a great nation. "I am God, the God of your father," said. "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there." Genesis 46:3. With this promise, Jacob continued his journey, bringing with him his entire family and possessions. When Jacob finally arrived in Egypt, the reunion with Joseph was one of the most emotional moments of his life. Joseph, upon seeing his father, ran to embrace him, and they wept together for a long time. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. Genesis 46:29. The father and son, separated by so many years of pain and longing, were finally reunited, and the family of Israel was whole once again. Pharaoh, recognizing Joseph's importance, offered Jacob's family the best land in Egypt, the land of Goshen, so they could live and prosper. Jacob, his sons, and all their descendants settled there, where they lived safely during the years of famine. Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramesses, as Pharaoh directed. Genesis 47:11. God's providence had turned a story of suffering into a story of redemption and blessings. Jacob's final years in Egypt were filled with peace and prosperity, surrounded by his family and under Joseph's loving care. He lived for another 17 years, witnessing the growth and prosperity of his children and grandchildren in the land of Goshen. Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years, and the years of his life were 147, Genesis 47:28. This time with his family brought joy to the patriarch, who had faced so much sorrow throughout his life. As he felt the end approaching, Jacob called for Joseph to bless him and make one last request. He asked Joseph to swear not to bury him in Egypt, but to take his body back to Canaan, to be laid to rest with his ancestors in the cave of Machpelah. Then he gave them these instructions: "I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite." Genesis 49:29. Joseph, faithful to his father's wish, promised to fulfill this final request. Before he died, Jacob gathered his sons to bless them and prophesy about each of their futures. Jacob's words were full of meaning and revealed the destinies of the tribes of Israel. After blessing his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed and breathed his last, intent to have seen the restoration of his family. When Jacob had finished giving instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. Genesis 49:33. With Pharaoh's permission, Joseph organized a grand funeral procession to take Jacob's body back to Canaan. Joseph and his brothers, along with a large number of Egyptians, made the long journey to bury Jacob in the cave of Machpelah as he had desired. So Jacob's sons did as he had commanded them. Genesis 50:12. Jacob's death marked the end of an era, but also the continuation of God's promises, which were beginning to be fulfilled in a grand way in the lives of his descendants. After Jacob's death, Joseph's brothers feared that he would finally take revenge for the wrongs they had done to him. Without their father's presence to protect them, they were anxious, fearing Joseph's wrath. They sent a message to Joseph, asking for mercy, reminding him of Jacob's words before he died. "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly." Genesis 50:6-17. When Joseph received the message, he was deeply moved and wept, called his brothers and spoke to them gently, dispelling their fears. "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Genesis 50:19-20. Joseph understood that everything that had happened was part of God's sovereign plan, and he chose to fully forgive his brothers. Joseph continued to care for his brothers and their families, ensuring that they lived in peace and prosperity in Egypt. He reassured them that he had no intention of seeking revenge, but that God's purpose was greater than any offense suffered. "So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Genesis 50:21. The reconciliation was complete, and Jacob's family remained united under Joseph's loving care. Joseph's life, marked by betrayal and suffering, was also a story of redemption and reconciliation. His journey, from slavery to the governorship of Egypt, was a testimony to God's power to turn evil into good. Joseph's trust in God never wavered, and his generous forgiveness reflected the divine grace he had experienced. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Romans 8:28. Joseph chose to see beyond the offenses and embrace God's greater purpose. The years passed, and Joseph lived to the ripe old age of 110, seeing children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren grow up. He was blessed with a long life, full of accomplishments, and most importantly, of reconciliation and peace. Joseph witnessed the prosperity of his family in the land of Goshen, under his leadership and God's protection. Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Also the children of Machir son of Manasseh were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Genesis 50:23. At the end of his life, Joseph gathered his brothers and reminded them of God's promise to bring the people of Israel out of Egypt and back to the promised land. He made them swear that when that day came, they would carry his bones back to Canaan to be buried with his ancestors. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Genesis 50:24. Joseph, confident in God and the promise he had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, reaffirmed the faith that had sustained him throughout his life. He reminded his family that, though they were in Egypt, this was not their final destination. And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place." Genesis 50:25. His unwavering faith, even in his last moments, was a powerful testimony to future generations. After Joseph's death, he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt, where his remains stayed until the Exodus, when Moses led the Israelites out of Pharaoh's land. Though Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. Genesis 50:26. Joseph's story, marked by trials and triumphs, ended with the assurance that God would fulfill his promise. Centuries later, Joseph's bones were carried to Canaan and buried in the promised land, just as he had desired. Joseph's life is a profound testament to the power of faith and the mysterious workings of God's providence. From the pit of betrayal by his brothers to the pinnacle of power in Egypt, Joseph's journey was marked by trials that would have shattered many, yet he remained steadfast. He endured slavery, false accusations, and imprisonment. But through it all, he clung to his faith and integrity. Each hardship seemed to distance him from his dreams, yet each was a crucial step in God's intricate plan for his life. One of the most striking lessons from Joseph's story is that God's plans often unfold in ways that defy our understanding. What seems like a setback can be a divine setup for something greater. Joseph's unwavering faithfulness in the mundane, whether as a servant in Potiphar's house or as a prisoner, was the very foundation that prepared him for the monumental task ahead. His story teaches us that when we hold true to our values, even in the face of injustice, we position ourselves to receive the fullness of God's blessings and purpose. Another deep lesson is the transformative power of forgiveness and reconciliation. Despite the unimaginable pain inflicted by his brothers, Joseph chose to forgive, recognizing that what they intended for harm, God used for good. His forgiveness not only mended his family, but also fulfilled God's covenant to preserve the line of Israel. This act of grace illustrates that true strength lies not in holding on to bitterness, but in embracing the healing power of God's love and mercy. Joseph's journey from the depths of despair to the heights of power is not merely a story of survival. It is a powerful declaration of God's sovereignty and grace. It reminds us that no matter how dark our circumstances, God's light can pierce through. Joseph's rise from the pit to the palace is a vivid illustration of how God can take the shattered fragments of our lives and transform them into a masterpiece, triumph. His legacy challenges us to trust in God's perfect timing, to remain unshakable in our faith, and to believe that even our greatest trials can be the foundation of our most extraordinary victory. We have reached the end of Joseph's journey, a story that teaches us about faithfulness, perseverance, and the transformative power of God. Joseph's life shows us that even in the darkest situations, God is weaving something grand. As I reflect on everything he endured, from betrayal to redemption, I'm invited to seek that same trust in God for my own life. Before we close, I would like to offer a prayer, just as Joseph entrusted his life to the Lord. I want to pray, asking God to grant me the strength to face my trials, the wisdom to see his purpose in everything I do, and the faith to remain steadfast until the end. I invite you to join me in this prayer, bringing before God all your concerns, dreams, and challenges. Let's pray. Lord God Almighty, I bow before you in reverence and gratitude, remembering the life of Joseph, who remained faithful even in the most difficult trials. Like him, I want to be faithful to your purpose for my life, even when the path is hard and the answers seem distant. Grant me, Lord, the strength to resist temptation, patience to wait for the right time, and the wisdom to understand that every trial is part of your divine plan. Lord, help me to maintain integrity and faith, just as Joseph did, trusting in you, even when everything seemed lost. May I see beyond the current difficulties and realize that you are shaping my character for something much greater. Just as Joseph, may I be a channel of your grace and love, blessing others with the wisdom and discernment from you. May my faithfulness to you be a reflection of your faithfulness in every aspect of my life. Heavenly Father, bless my personal life, my career, my projects and strategies, just as you blessed Joseph. May I prosper in everything I do, not for my own glory, but yours. I pray for my family, that we may be strengthened in love and unity, and that your peace may rule in our hearts. May I, like Joseph, see your hand guiding every step, knowing that you are working all things together for my good. Finally, grant me the grace to remain faithful until the end, always remembering that those who persevere will receive the crown of life. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. Revelation 2:10. May I finish my race with joy, knowing that your promise is true, and that nothing can separate me from your love. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.